347 days. That's how long we've been waiting since Donald Trump stood before the American people and promised, not suggested, not hoped, promised that he would end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours of taking office. And here's where it gets complicated, because what just happened in Florida tells us everything we need to know about why that promise was never about peace at all. I want you to picture this scene with me. It's Sunday, December 28th. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's plane touches down in Miami. The man has just left a city, his capital, that was attacked with over 500 drones and 40 missiles barely 24 hours earlier. Buildings are burning. At least 2 people are dead. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are sitting in the dark without heat in the middle of winter. And when Zelensky steps off that plane, who's there to greet him? Not a cabinet secretary, not a senior diplomat, not even a mid-level State Department official. His own ambassador had to be the welcoming committee. Now, what I'm about to show you changes the whole picture. Before Zelensky even arrived at Mar-a-Lago, Trump was already on the phone, but not with his intelligence services, not with his national security team. He was on the phone with Vladimir Putin, the man who launched this invasion, the man whose missiles were still falling on Kyiv. Trump got on Truth Social afterward and called it good and very productive. He spoke with Putin for over an hour before sitting down with the leader of the country Putin is actively trying to destroy. Think about that sequencing for a moment. Really think about it. You're Zelensky. Your city is smoking. Your people are dying. And the leader of your most important ally just spent the morning chatting with the guy who's killing them. And then Trump walks into that dining room at Mar-a-Lago and acts like he's doing you a favor. But here's what nobody's talking about. After the meeting, after Zelensky presented his 20-point peace plan, after all the handshakes and the press conference where Trump called everything terrific, something very strange happened. The Kremlin suddenly claimed that Ukraine had just launched 91 drones at Putin's personal residence in the Novgorod region. A massive assassination attempt, they said. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who normally doesn't brief on military operations, came out and said Moscow would revise its negotiating position. That retaliation was coming. Wait, it gets worse. Putin personally called Trump to tell him about this alleged attack. And according to the Kremlin's own aide, Trump was shocked. Trump told reporters later that he was very angry about it, very angry at Ukraine, without a single shred of evidence, without consulting his own intelligence agencies, without even asking basic questions. The timing was surgical. Zelensky and Trump had just announced they were 90% in agreement on a peace framework. Security guarantees, agreed. Military dimensions, agreed. And suddenly, out of nowhere, Russia manufactures a crisis that gives them an excuse to harden their position, to walk back any concessions, to blame Ukraine for sabotaging diplomacy. And Trump bought it, at first anyway. But this is the part that kept me up last night. Because what happened next tells us something crucial about how this entire process has been working. The CIA, yes, Trump's own CIA, did an assessment. And sources are now confirming that CIA Director John Ratcliffe briefed Trump personally on what they found. There was no attack on Putin's residence. None. Ukraine was targeting a military facility elsewhere in the Novgorod region, one they'd hit before. The Kremlin's story was, in the words of one analyst I've been following, perfectly timed theater. Local residents in Valdai told independent journalists they heard nothing. No drones, no explosions, no air raid alerts on their phones. One resident put it simply, if something like that had happened, the whole town would have been talking about it. Russia's own defense ministry initially said only 18 drones were shot down over the entire Novgorod region that night. It was only after Lavrov's dramatic announcement that they suddenly claimed 49 more drones shot down over Bryansk, hundreds of kilometers away, were also somehow heading for Putin's house. And then after being briefed by the CIA, Trump changed his tune. He reposted an editorial with the headline, "Putin attack bluster shows Russia is the one standing in the way of peace." So what just happened here? What are we actually witnessing? I'm going to break this down for you because the implications go far beyond this single incident. What we're watching is not a negotiation. It's a performance. And understanding the difference might be the most important thing any of us can do right now. Let me take you back to 1994. Ukraine had just inherited the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world from the Soviet Union. The United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia signed something called the Budapest Memorandum. The deal was simple. Ukraine gives up its nuclear weapons, and in exchange, these great powers would guarantee Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. They promised never to use military force against Ukraine, never to threaten it, never to violate its borders. And then this happened. Russia took Crimea in 2014. Russia invaded the rest of Ukraine in 2022. The Budapest Memorandum became, in Zelensky's own words, a monument to short-sightedness in strategic security decision-making. Now, here's what I find fascinating about the Mar-a-Lago meeting. Zelensky stood there and told reporters that Trump had offered 15-year security guarantees as part of the peace framework. 15 years. And when a reporter asked Zelensky if that was enough, he pushed back. He said he'd asked Trump to consider 30 years, 40 years, even 50 years, an historic commitment that would fundamentally reshape Europe's security architecture. And Trump's response? He said he would think about it. But that's not even the real story, because here's what security guarantees actually mean, or rather what they don't mean coming from this administration. Trump has already ruled out deploying peacekeeping troops. He's spoken dismissively about the mechanisms Ukraine considers essential. And when pressed on what exactly these guarantees would look like, he told one reporter it was a dumb question, because nobody even knows what the security agreement is going to say. That's the president of the United States calling it a dumb question when asked about the specifics of security guarantees he's offering to a country fighting for its survival. Meanwhile, Russia's position hasn't moved an inch. The Kremlin still demands Ukraine cede the entire Donbas region. They still demand Ukraine never join NATO. They still occupy the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, Europe's largest. And Trump praised Putin for being very good about not bombing it. Putin seized that plant by force in March 2022. He's been occupying it ever since. And Trump is giving him credit for not destroying it. The pressure, you see, flows in one direction. It always has. Ukraine is asked to compromise. Ukraine is asked to prove its reasonableness. Ukraine is asked to hold referendums on giving away its own territory. And Russia? Russia gets to escalate rhetorically and militarily, manufacture fake assassination attempts, and still be treated as a good faith partner in negotiations. When Trump was asked about the thorniest issues, he said it was the land. Some of that land has been taken, he said. Some of it is maybe up for grabs. Up for grabs. We're talking about territory that Russia seized at gunpoint. Territory where Ukrainian civilians are still being killed, still being deported, still having their property stolen. And the president of the United States describes it as up for grabs. Zelensky's response was clear. We have to respect our law and our people. We respect the territory which we control. He said any decisions about territory would have to go to the Ukrainian people through a referendum because it's their land, the land of their nation for generations. But here's where it gets complicated again. Russia launched that massive attack on Kyiv, 500 drones, 40 missiles, Kinzhal hypersonic weapons, the day before the Mar-a-Lago meeting. Zelensky called it Russia's answer to peace efforts. And he's right. That is how Putin negotiates, not through diplomacy, through destruction. One woman in Kyiv, Olena Karpenko, described hearing a man burned to death in the attack. His scream is still in my ears, she said. I can't believe it. More than 10 residential buildings were damaged. 2,600 apartment buildings lost heating. 320,000 homes lost power. And this wasn't an accident. This was a message. So let's talk about what this peace process actually looks like from the inside, because the gap between the performance and the reality is staggering. Trump has now spoken with Putin 9 times since taking office, 9 phone calls. And in almost every one of these conversations, there's a pattern that emerges. Putin makes claims. Trump accepts them. And Ukraine gets squeezed. Remember what happened in February? Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance brought Zelensky to the White House to sign a minerals deal, and it devolved into a public spectacle. Trump and Vance accused Zelensky of being disrespectful. They told him he doesn't have the cards. They berated a wartime president on camera while his country was under bombardment. That meeting was supposed to be a breakthrough. Instead, it became a humiliation ritual. And the question I keep asking myself is, why? What purpose does it serve to publicly degrade the leader of a country you claim to want to help? The answer, I think, lies in understanding who Trump's real audience is. It's not Ukraine. It's not even Russia necessarily. It's the American public, specifically the part of the American public that sees all of this as theater, as a show of strength, as proof that Trump is the deal maker he claims to be. But theater is not strategy. And here's where this latest episode becomes so revealing. When Russia made that fake claim about the drone attack on Putin's residence, several countries immediately condemned Ukraine. The United Arab Emirates strongly condemned the alleged attack. India's prime minister expressed deep concern. Pakistan's prime minister called it deplorable. All of this happened before anyone had seen a single piece of evidence, before anyone had asked whether the story was even true. Meanwhile, European leaders who actually have skin in this game, leaders whose countries are on the front lines of what happens if Russia wins, were far more cautious. The EU's foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, called Russia's accusation a deliberate distraction. And she was right. One analyst I've been following put it perfectly. Putin is trying to engineer enough cover for the Trump administration to enable him to press on with his hardline demands while avoiding having to make any concessions himself. And that's exactly what we're seeing. Russia gets to play both sides. They negotiate during the day while bombing at night. They accuse Ukraine of terrorism while committing atrocities. They demand territory they stole while crying victim about alleged attacks on their leader's vacation home. This is the part that really concerns me, because the fundamental asymmetry at the heart of this conflict keeps getting erased from the conversation. Ukraine is fighting for survival. Russia is attempting to redraw borders by force. These are not equivalent positions. There is no both sides here. When Trump says that both presidents want to make a deal, he's erasing the fact that one of those presidents started this war. When he says that the people of Ukraine want it to end, he's ignoring that the people of Ukraine overwhelmingly say they will not recognize occupied territories as Russian, 76%, according to recent polling. The peace that Trump is trying to broker isn't a peace that protects Ukraine. It's a peace that rewards Russian aggression. And if that sounds harsh, consider what we know about Russia's actual demands. They want Ukraine to surrender all of Donbass. They want guarantees that Ukraine will never join NATO. They want sanctions lifted. They want to keep the territory they've stolen. What has Russia offered in return? A temporary ceasefire here and there, 30 hours for Easter, a few days for Victory Day celebrations. Ceasefires that they themselves violated. Ceasefires designed not to end the war, but to consolidate their gains while the world pretends progress is being made. So where does this leave us? What happens next? And more importantly, what should we be watching for in the weeks ahead? Trump says teams are very close to a deal. He says 95% of the issues are resolved. But that remaining 5%? That's the land. That's Ukraine's future. That's whether millions of Ukrainians will live as free people or under Russian occupation. You don't get to call that a minor detail. You don't get to wave away the fate of entire cities, entire regions, entire generations with a percentage point. Zelensky and European leaders are scheduled to meet in Washington sometime this month to continue negotiations. There's talk of a Paris summit with the coalition of the willing in early January. More phone calls, more meetings, more photo opportunities. The diplomatic carousel keeps spinning. But here's what I keep coming back to. What has actually changed since Trump took office? Russia is still advancing on the battlefield. They captured over 4,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory in 2025 alone. That's less than 1% of Ukraine's total land mass, but it represents cities, towns, villages, real places where real people lived before Russian shells turned them to rubble. They're still bombing cities, still targeting energy infrastructure, still trying to freeze Ukraine into submission. And Trump's big promise, the one he made 53 separate times during the campaign, according to one fact-checker's count, that promise to end the war in 24 hours, he now calls it an exaggeration. He says he was being sarcastic. He says it was all just figurative. 347 days of figurative peace while real people die. The Budapest Memorandum taught Ukraine a devastating lesson. Security assurances from great powers aren't worth the paper they're printed on if there's no mechanism to enforce them. Ukraine gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, weapons that could have deterred exactly the kind of invasion they're now suffering, in exchange for promises. Promises from the United States, promises from the United Kingdom, promises from Russia itself. And where are those promises now? Russia violated them completely. The U.S. and U.K. responded with sanctions and aid, but no one was willing to go to war to defend Ukraine's borders. No one was willing to risk direct confrontation with a nuclear-armed Russia. The guarantees meant nothing when they were actually tested. Now, 30 years later, we're watching a new version of the same story unfold. Trump is offering guarantees without enforcement, promises without details, peace without justice, 15 years of security commitments that no one can explain how they would actually work. And Russia is taking notes because Russia understands that in the absence of real consequences, words are just words. Putin has seen what happens when you violate international agreements. He's seen the limits of Western resolve. He's calculated that the costs of aggression are manageable, and so far, nothing has proven him wrong. The question I keep asking myself is whether any of this is really about ending the war, or whether it's about ending the appearance of the war, whether it's about protecting Ukraine or about protecting the narrative that Trump is a master negotiator who can solve problems no one else can. Because if you strip away the press conferences and the handshakes and the phone calls, what you see is something deeply troubling. You see a president who spoke with Putin before meeting with Zelensky, who initially believed Russia's fabricated attack claims over Ukraine's denials, who described stolen territory as up for grabs, who praised Putin for not bombing a nuclear plant he stole, who called a question about security guarantee specifics dumb. You see pressure flowing in one direction, always toward Ukraine, never toward Russia. You see a country being asked to make concessions while its cities burn. You see security guarantees being offered by an administration that can't or won't explain what they mean. You see Russia facing no consequences for continued attacks during so-called peace negotiations. And you see a pattern that should concern everyone who cares about what happens when the rules of international order break down. Because if Russia succeeds here, if they're allowed to seize territory through force and keep it through negotiations, what message does that send to every other country watching? What message does it send to China about Taiwan? What message does it send to North Korea about South Korea? What message does it send to every would-be aggressor calculating whether the benefits of territorial conquest outweigh the costs? The answer, I fear, is a dangerous one, that aggression works, that might makes right, that the international community will eventually tire of resistance and hand you what you took at gunpoint. This isn't just about Ukraine. It never was. This is about whether we live in a world where borders are respected or a world where they're redrawn by whoever has the bigger army. And right now, the way these negotiations are going, the answer seems to be heading in a direction that should trouble all of us. There's another dimension to this that doesn't get enough attention. What happens inside Ukraine if a deal is signed that the Ukrainian people see as a betrayal? Zelensky has said repeatedly that any territorial decisions must go to a referendum. The Ukrainian constitution requires it. But 76% of Ukrainians say they will not accept recognizing occupied territories as Russian. 76%. What happens if Trump and Putin reach an agreement that the Ukrainian people reject? What happens if Zelensky is forced to sign something his own population won't accept? Does the war simply continue, but now without American support? Does Ukraine fracture politically? Does Russia use any hesitation as an excuse for further aggression? These aren't hypothetical questions. These are the real stakes of what's being negotiated right now in phone calls and dining rooms and summit meetings. And I'm not sure anyone in Washington is thinking seriously about the answers. Zelensky said something at that press conference that's been stuck in my head. He said that earlier guarantees, including the Budapest Memorandum, did not work for Kyiv. Security guarantees, he said, are not abstract language. They're the core lesson of 3 decades of broken promises. He's asking for 30 years of protection, 40 years, 50 years. He's asking because he knows that anything less is just another piece of paper that can be torn up the moment it becomes inconvenient. He's asking because he's seen what happens when great powers make promises they don't intend to keep. And Trump said he would think about it. I want to leave you with this thought. In February, when Trump and Vance publicly humiliated Zelensky in the Oval Office, they told him he doesn't have the cards. They meant it as a statement of power. Ukraine is weak, America is strong, and Zelensky should be grateful for whatever scraps he's offered. But here's the thing about cards. The game isn't over yet. Ukraine is still fighting. Ukrainian soldiers are still holding the line. Ukrainian civilians are still rebuilding after every Russian attack. The war continues because Ukrainians have decided that their freedom is worth fighting for, even against impossible odds. The question isn't whether Ukraine has cards. The question is whether the United States will play its cards on behalf of freedom or on behalf of convenience, whether we'll stand with a democracy under assault or cut a deal with the dictator who's assaulting it, whether security guarantees will mean something this time or whether there'll be another set of empty promises waiting to be broken. I'm curious what you think about this. Are we watching a genuine peace process or something else entirely? And if it's something else, if this is really about performance rather than protection, what does that mean for what comes next? Does this change how you see the situation? Let me know in the comments. I genuinely want to hear your perspective on this because I think these are questions we all need to be asking.